Good afternoon. This is James Schmeling. I'm President and CEO of the National Defense University Foundation, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. This webinar is made possible by Leidos and the sponsorship of Leidos. Our board member, Bill Bender, is our key contact at Leidos, and thank you to Bill for making this possible. We appreciate it. We will be starting this morning with an introduction to Christian Brose, and I will be turning it over to Admiral Rogie in just a moment. This webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it later and to share it with others. And we want to make sure that it's available to you so that you can share it as widely as you'd like. I think there's some interesting lessons. I finished his book last night and I'm looking forward to the discussion. We actually have Q&A that was submitted by you as you registered. We'll be asking those questions in a moment. In addition, you can ask your questions in the side panel in the questions tab, and we'll be screening those questions to ask to Christian in a moment. With that, I'd like to turn it to Admiral Rogie, the President of National Defense University, for his opening remarks. Thank you, Admiral Rogie.
Okay, so sorry, I was playing with my buttons there to get unmuted and get my camera on. I apologize for all of you who would prefer my camera remain off. James, thanks for the introduction and for hosting the briefing today. For everybody, you know, the National Defense University Foundation is one of the university's most important partners. But of course, the reality is that every one of you who's listening today is one of our partners because of our shared interest in the security of our nation. I'd like to give a special thanks to Chris Brose for serving as our speaker today. And of course, I would encourage everybody to read his book, Kill Chain. The idea of breaking the kill chain is exactly what we try to enable here at NDU by taking preemptive action for our national defense by educating professionals to become those senior leaders across military, government, industry, and our foreign partners that our nation will depend upon tomorrow. It's our goal to help them to think critically and strategically and to be comfortable with dealing with uncertainty and ambiguity and with dynamic and disruptive change. And so I'm certain that this crowd appreciates that we live in a world which is increasingly characterized by that kind of dynamic and disruptive change. We face many competitors and threats to our security, and to counter these threats, we require leaders who can outthink our adversaries. And that's because the technological superiority that we've long enjoyed is important, but insufficient to deliver the warfighting advantage that our nation demands and our service members deserve. And in fact, competitors are investing heavily to try to erode our technical advantages, so it's imperative we also create intellectual advantage. And that's our job at NDU. We try and develop those critical thinkers, joint warfighters, and strategic leaders who provide the U.S. and allies with the intellectual overmatch required to prevail. And our students are in equal parts military members of the U.S. Armed Services, civilians from across the U.S. government, department, and agencies, and this year 120 international students from 65 friendly partner and allied nations. And if we do well at our education mission, then these students who come to us as tactical experts in their fields will graduate with the ability to launch the kind of ideas that could preclude the need to launch weapons. And that's a positive effect that reaches far beyond the classroom and beyond graduation day, because the ways in which the U.S. and our partners work together on common security challenges are ways that are increasingly joint and interagency and international. In the words of former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, education is quite simply peace building by another name. It is the most effective form of defense spending there is. So let me then suggest that if you would want the leaders of your national security enterprise, the key decision makers contributing to your peace and security, if you would want them ideally to be educated in how to do so, then you should not only be partners of NDU, but advocates. And I hope that that will encourage you to learn more about the Chairman's University, your National Defense University. So with that, I'm now pleased to turn over the microphone to Chris Brose, Chief Strategy Officer, Anduril Industries Incorporated, and the author of The Kill Chain, Defending America in the Future of High-Tech Warfare. Chris, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Admiral Rogie. I really appreciate the kind introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today for you guys hosting me. I'll be very brief. I really look forward to the conversation with James and everybody who's participating. The thing that I really just want to say at the beginning is how much I appreciate the work that the National Defense University does, the support they get from the NDU Foundation. I was a big supporter during my time in the Senate for the mission of NDU, which I think Admiral Rogi just summed up, certainly better than I can. And what I hope we can do here today is have a great conversation, directly in the spirit that he just mentioned about the ideas that are going to be successful for our military advantage in the future. And that's really what I wrote the book to try to discuss. Certainly, it's a book about technology. It's a book about what our adversaries are doing. But ultimately, I think for me, the focus is really at that level of ideas. We need to be better about outthinking our adversaries rather than being outthought by them. So really, with that, I'll be quiet for the moment and really just look forward to having a conversation and getting into hearing what the audience has to say. Because again, I'm confident that the folks on the line, have been working these problems and are knowledgeable about these problems, and really eager to hear from them and have a discussion.
Chris, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I finished your book last night. It was very interesting. I started it much earlier and I read and I thought about it a lot. I went off to a couple of other things, came back to it repeatedly. And what I thought was interesting is the premise that you begin with, that we have everything that we need in order to change our systems, but we're not doing it. We have
Yes.
a lot going on in Congress. We have a lot of things that are happening in DoD. We have a lot of authorities that we need to pursue the right acquisition strategies. We have all of the, I think, key items, but perhaps not yet the willpower to make these massive changes that you were talking about in the book. The change from massive platforms, things like carriers, to unmanned machines and all of those sorts of things were interesting. The idea of moving away from being able to dominate the space into being able to prevent others to dominate the space. Those are all really innovative concepts. And so I'd love to know what inspired you to write the book, and why do you think this book will make a difference?
Yeah, why did I write the book is a question that I asked myself, I think, every day that I was working on writing the book. I wrote the book for a couple of reasons. In the time that I spent on the Senate Armed Services Committee, 9 years all in, I increasingly became really concerned about, kind of the position of the U.S. military vis-a-vis, kind of emerging great power peer competitors. My concern was that we were increasingly being disrupted, and that we found ourselves in the very traditional kind of role of a kind of status quo actor or power that was being disrupted by competitors who had different ways of thinking about the problems and were moving with a sense of urgency to kind of undermine the way we build and operate military systems, and the way we are going to sort of move into the future. So with respect to the disruption from the adversary standpoint, my concern as I kind of played out my tenure in the Senate was just watching the pace with which China in particular was building and fielding military capabilities that were purpose-built to call into question and undermine the ways that the United States military has traditionally projected power. And the speed with which they were doing that, the sort of breadth of that endeavor, the ways that they were really thinking about and harnessing emerging technologies like autonomous systems and artificial intelligence, hypersonics, et cetera, to really build a military that was not designed to replicate the United States, but was purpose-built to play a different game, and really undermine the ways that U.S. military advantage has been sort of built and sustained for really the past 30 years. Similarly, I was concerned that this technological revolution that we've been living in for many years now is just gaining speed, and that in that respect, the United States was also being left behind from sort of a military technological or national security technological standpoint, that we have been too beholden to the ways that we have done things and the things that we have relied upon to do them, that it's been very difficult, excuse me, to think in a different way about how you could solve the problems that we're being confronted with operationally, how we could build different kinds of military systems that in many cases are very different than what we've traditionally relied upon for our military advantage, but that nonetheless would create a more effective force, a more effective network of systems. And then a lot of those technologies are being developed farther, faster, kind of at greater scale in the commercial world than they are in the defense world. And that there's a lot of opportunity that the Department of Defense was missing out on, that the Congress was missing out on from the standpoint of really harnessing these emerging technologies, not just to make the things that we've always used better, but to think about, reimagining the way we build military capability and operate it for the future. So it was sort of these two challenges of being disrupted by competitors as well as being disrupted by technology, and just kind of the growing concern that I had is, sort of every year that I spent in the Senate, that America was at risk of falling behind to a degree that I think most Americans just are not aware of. And it's a conversation that we have, sort of in sort of expert circles and sort of inside the Beltway, inside the defense establishment. But I really wanted to write a book for more of an informed general audience to try to bring these issues before kind of a wider set of the American public, to focus the minds of more Americans on, I think, one of the most transcendent problems we have from a national security standpoint, and to try to build more political support, more public support for the kinds of, I think, very difficult, very challenging kinds of changes and reforms, like you mentioned, that I think we're going to have to carry out here in the very near future. We're going to end up in a future that is very different than one that we've expected, very different than the past that we've enjoyed, and ultimately, I think, a very dangerous place for our country.
So one of the things you talk about is the idea that a lot of defense spending is spread out across the country for political purposes and to support existing platforms that support existing jobs and existing companies, but that we have to think about doing things a little bit differently. And now you've just talked about getting this out to a wide public audience. Do you think that the public is going to be able to influence others in Congress to make those hard decisions, or do you think that they're just going to be aware of it and so more accepting of those hard decisions?
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, that's the hope, right? I think the hope is that it's not to say that the country is going to stand up and sort of lead our leadership, but I think it is to say that to the extent that more of these issues are understood more widely, that there's more of a recognition of the precarious position that I think we find ourselves in from a national defense standpoint, and that there's an appreciation, or at least a more informed understanding of, operationally what we should be thinking about, how we should be looking to do things differently, strategically, operationally, and the opportunity that we have from a technological standpoint, that there will become a greater sense of urgency to demand these kinds of changes, to be more accepting of them, be more willing to kind of run the risks that I think we're going to have to run as we look at a limited amount of defense dollars that get spent every year, which are likely going to go down in the future in the aftermath of COVID and other things. The very difficult choices that are going to have to be made with the trade-offs that those inevitably entail, to try to create a more receptive audience for at least thinking about these are things that we need to do, and be more willing to have the conversation about specifically what should that look like, so that we can have the kind of future of defense that that I think we need to have, and that Americans expect their government to deliver.
One of the questions from the audience is, do you think our form of government is agile enough to be able to compete with these other powers, particularly authoritarian regimes like China that can meld their commercial, business, and defense industries?
Yeah, I think that in these competitions we have advantages and we have disadvantages, and there are some of those disadvantages that you mentioned, the ways in which authoritarian governments can just kind of run roughshod over public opinion and law and policy and things that we take seriously here in the country. I think one of the things that we have that truly is to our advantage is we have a much more flexible and dynamic and adaptive system than they do. We have a much more entrepreneurial system, that I think history shows, and I tried to go through some of this history in the book, that when we actually put our minds to it as a country, when we are focused on solving these very difficult national security problems. The government has an ability to create incentives that get the best out of the public sector and the best out of the private sector, the best out of investors and technologists, which I think really is the comparative advantage of the United States of America, is just this sort of dynamic, critical thinking, entrepreneurial energy that exists in our society, and the ability to unleash that, in very focused ways to solve these problems at scale. Is something that we have done before, and it's certainly something that we can do again. Like you said at the beginning of our conversation, my belief and what I argue in the book is that we actually have all of those critical raw materials. We have plenty of money in the defense budget, and certainly in our sort of economy and investment community writ large. We have amazing technology, much of it in the defense establishment, much of it outside the defense establishment in the commercial world. And we have, as we're talking about, incredible critical thinking, talented entrepreneurial, hardworking people, both in and out of government, both executive and legislative branches. It's just a question of getting the incentives right to get the best performance out of that, sort of innovation ecosystem, if you want to call it that. I think that's where we've fallen short in recent years. But I also think that if we get our act together, if we get out of our own way, I actually feel very confident that we can outcompete competitors, who have structural disadvantages that we do not have, and we can talk more about that.
That's great. So in the book, you give a couple of examples of the way that we developed weapon systems in the 40s and 50s, and the way that we gave a person permission to run a specialized lab or procurement authorities or other things. And then they responded with the best-in-class systems on very shortened timeframes. And then you talk about a little bit later in the book that we actually have those now. We just don't necessarily know or use them effectively. You talk about escalation, for instance, to General Milley of the $17 million study to buy handguns as an interesting example of that, as opposed to running down to Cabela's with a $17 million charge card. I think there are some interesting organizations in the military that are doing that, but as a whole, perhaps we're not. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, so I think, particularly in recent years, you've seen, kind of the growth and proliferation of a lot of organizations who are charged with innovation, who are charged with going out and finding innovative companies or innovative capabilities and trying to bring them into the defense establishment. So, your Naval X's, your DIUs, your AFWorks, places like that, and that's good. It has never been easier, I think, for small companies, new entrants, innovators, to get on contract to do a small amount of work or build an initial prototype of something. I think the bigger challenge is now what it has been, really for the past few decades, which is how do you scale that? How do you get those, promising new technologies or promising new capabilities or an interesting demonstration or a compelling prototype across that proverbial valley of death into larger scale programs of record? And that's, I think, the thing where it's not a lack of acquisition authority. We have plenty of acquisition authority to do it. It's certainly not a lack of money. We have hundreds of billions of dollars that we're spending on our national defense every year. I think the biggest limiting factor that I've seen is it's the access to money in year of execution. We tie ourselves in knots. Congress ties the department in knots. The department ties itself in knots about the ability to move money quickly in year of execution to solve these kinds of problems as they emerge. I think, arguably an even bigger challenge than that is just the focus of senior leaders on solving, particular operational problems and what collection of technologies and capabilities they're going to need to do that, so that they at their level are the ones really pulling these kinds of, promising capabilities across that valley of death and helping them scale. That is something that I think we have fallen down in the past 30 years or so, largely because it hasn't been as much of a necessity. America has been so far ahead that if innovative technologies haven't been scaling, we've still not felt the kind of tangible effects of that. And I think that's just not the world we're living in anymore. If we do not, excuse me, deploy these new technologies and capabilities at scale, we will lose our advantage and we will fall behind. So having leadership that has the, sort of the political will to use authorities that they have to take the risks that only they at the senior leadership level can take, and sort of own the political risk of making a big bet, making a big investment, making a big divestment away from something that we've relied on for a very long period of time in favor of something new and perhaps less proven. That's why senior leaders get elected to Congress. That's why they get confirmed for senior positions by the Senate. That's what we need senior leaders to do, and sort of make it more a focus of their mission as such, to really own the understanding of what those decisions need to be, so that they can make them at a more granular level, and use the sort of awesome authority that they have to really sort of push innovation at scale.
So one of the things you talked about during the book and its later chapters was some discussion around the control of machines and the interpretation of data, the ability of machines to control other machines and to do the work that analysts are doing now, and the decentralization of this hub and spoke model, and maybe more to edge computing, and the ability to bring all of the kinds of computing and sensing together. So one of the questions from our audience goes to that, I think, a little bit. It's a fairly technical question, but the question is, DoD has established a joint all-domain command and control, JADC2, cross-functional team. It has a very ambitious goal of developing C2 structures and technologies that link, quote, any shooter, any sensor. Is the department biting off more than it can chew? What are your thoughts on this approach, given your research?
Yeah, I think the aspiration is right. Like the fact that we are having consistent senior level conversations about command and control, all domain command and control, I think is progress. I think the challenge is, as it has always been, and I try to unpack this a bit in terms of recent history in the book, how do I take an overarching concept like joint all domain command and control that means so many different things to so many different people, that's such a large, complex undertaking, and actually begin to build that? That's where I think the department needs to do a better job of focusing more specifically on what are the handful of operational problems from a joint force perspective that we need to be able to have these kinds of command and control capabilities to solve. If you don't do that, joint all domain command and control becomes sort of new bottles that people pour old wine in, and it becomes a bumper sticker that people just kind of rename whatever they've been working hard at for the past 12 years. It's now joint all domain command and control. It becomes a theory of everything that means everything to everybody, and thus it turns into nothing. We've seen this happen before, and I think for the department to really make this not something that's overly broad, to not bite off more than they can chew, they actually have to pick some discrete problems where this kind of an approach needs to be worked out in the doing of it, and the sort of building and integration of technology. And this is what I try to focus on in the book, is to say, when we look at sort of innovations past, we didn't say, we want to, we did say, we want to have, kind of strategic advantage or strategic deterrence vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. But what we focused on specifically was the development of, intercontinental ballistic missiles that could deliver a very specific effect, at a very specific period of time. We bounded the problem in a way that military operators and engineers could understand what we were actually trying to build. And I think the same is true of JADC2. We have to boil this down to some core operational problems that we can then start to understand, what is the mixture of capabilities that I need to bring together to be able to solve this problem. And we need to focus on the problem as, the outcomes that we're trying to actually achieve. JADC2, from an outcome-oriented perspective, in my opinion, and what I try to write about in the book, is how quickly and at what scale can I close the kill chain? How quickly can I generate, and sort of what quality can I generate understanding, decision-making, the command and control and integration of effects to achieve outcomes. How much I can work through that process, at what scale, at what speed, needs to be the critical sort of metric that we are baselining ourselves against in these specific kind of operational endeavors. And if we don't do that, I think it's going to become, again, a theory of everything, a bumper sticker, and it's going to end badly.
So there's definitely some room to be very distinct in applying these and then putting them into practice and then expanding from there. So question from the audience: what are the Chinese and Russians doing right in this area that we should do to confront them more effectively?
Yeah, I'll focus on China because I think it's the more compelling case, although a lot of what I say I think is equally applicable to Russia to a lesser extent. I think what the Chinese have done is they've actually focused more specifically on the problems that they are building a military to solve. So what they began, really after the first Gulf War, in the early 1990s, was a concerted effort, not necessarily to try to recreate what the U.S. military has done, not to play the same game that we have, but to play a different game and to build specific military capabilities to break our kill chains, to call into question the ways we project military power. And they went about it very methodically with a great sense of urgency. So a lot of the key investments and sort of programmatic priorities that they've had, yes, they've been building aircraft carriers, here and there, but the bigger focus has been on long-range fires, kind of long-range sensors, the ability to kind of break the battle networks that the U.S. is fielding to take advantage of, kind of overwhelming air bases and sea bases and land bases with large quantities of very precision fires. Again, a focused military modernization effort around, specific operational problems that they identified as necessary to erode America's military advantage. And they have been moving with, an actually, pretty awe-inspiring pace to field those capabilities and scale them. And, I think for us, it's a similar type of challenge of we're not going to get to where we need to be by doubling down on the way we've always done things. The nature of being disrupted is that, the disruptor, or rather the disrupted, just can't keep plowing more money into the same approach, or it just is going to end worse for them. We're going to go bankrupt and still lose. So we need to stop and think differently. We need to think about, what are the things that we need to be doing to respond differently to ensure that, we can deny China the ability to project military power, that we don't necessarily need to control every space, but to the extent that we deny their ability to do so, that's still success. We need to think differently about, how we're actually sort of posturing and fielding these capabilities, how we're working with allies. But again, it's a very discrete focus on specific operational problems, networks of systems that we need to be able to field to solve those problems, and then moving out year over year over year to field those systems and improve them in an iterative way, and just consistently focus on rolling out better and better versions of our capabilities. That's essentially what the Chinese have been doing. It looks very, very similar to what we did as a country in the early Cold War period. And I think, that sense of urgency, that sense of focus, that sense of prioritization, and thinking differently about the problems is something that, we would do well to not necessarily to emulate, but to do ourselves.
So the question from the audience following that is, we'd like Chris to address two areas where we may not have a structural advantage. The principal one being the tension between supply and demand for forces, time, resources that exist between the service chiefs and the combatant commanders. And the second is the tension between present and future ops.
Yep. These are great challenges, and I wish I had better answers on them. I think that it's something that, taking the second first, the focus on present and future is one of weighing political risk. And that is something that senior leaders just have to manage and own. They have to be willing to say, what are the things that I need to be able to do in the future, the money that I need to spend, the readiness that I need to build, in order to be ready for a future problem, which is inevitably going to come at the expense of things that I'm not going to be able to do or to buy or to produce in the present. And I find that in recent years, we have put too many requirements on the military without sort of properly resourcing them, without prioritizing at the level of policy the things that we need to be doing and the things that we should cut away from. Divestments need to happen both in terms of programs as well as in terms of mission. And that's something that only senior leaders can own, and civilian leaders in particular. And that's something that we're just going to need to do a better job of, because we're not going to have enough money and sort of force to go around to do all the things that we might like to do when this more and more transcendent problem of great power competition is going to take up, as it should, more of our leader focus, our resources, our readiness. To the question on sort of the bureaucratic tensions between the supply and demand of force, I think this is something that I spent some time working on when I was in the Senate. It gets to the core question of the Goldwater-Nichols reforms that were done 30 years ago that really sort of specifically separated the service chiefs and the COCOMs, the role for supply and demand. However you slice it, you're going to end up with seams, and you're going to end up with inefficiencies and problems. I worry that we have become, too mired in the way that we adjudicate supply and demand, where it just isn't fast enough. It's not responsive enough. Which isn't to say that we necessarily want the commander of Indo-PACOM to be building his own military. But you can play that thought experiment out the other way and say that if that individual did have that responsibility, he wouldn't have as many of the shortfalls in critical munitions and other kind of enabling capabilities that Indo-PACOM commanders for many years have been highlighting and saying the services and the Joint Force are not delivering for them. We need to think about how to close that seam better. And it may actually be that we need a fundamental overhaul for how we divide things up from sort of a military bureaucratic standpoint. And that's something that we should actively look into and consider. But at a minimum, having, for example, our combatant commanders have more kind of in-year resources that they can use to make investments in kind of innovative capabilities to do kind of small scale experimentation, prototyping, potentially as a means of transitioning those capabilities into the services, something that allows them to have more ownership of solving the problems that they ultimately are the owners of, rather than having to rely on sort of the charity of others to solve those problems for them. I actually think there's a lot of merit in considering that. Where I find that we run into problems, pretty much everywhere, but specifically in government and in the national defense world, is when you have a separation between, authority and accountability, between a person who owns the problem and a person who has the solution, who owns the solution for that. And I fear that's where we've gotten with the sort of separation between our services and our combatant commands or our operational forces, is that the owners of the problem are not necessarily owners of the solution. And in order to align those things, it takes an enormous amount of time and bureaucratic effort, and it doesn't always get you to where you need to be. And while that may have been sufficient or adequate, for 20 or 15 years ago, I really worry that it's not going to be as fast and as responsive as it needs to be for the types of challenges that we're facing now, and certainly we will face in the future.
So a related question, could you speak to Matt Steckman's argument on the government's need to pick winners and the associated problems of capture of the services in Capitol Hill by the dominant prime defense contractors?
Well, if Matt Steckman said it, it's invariably wrong. I'm kidding. He's a colleague and a friend, and he's spot on with this. And I make much the similar argument in my book. We do need to have government in the position to pick winners, particularly when it concerns, as we were talking earlier, you have all these new entrants, you have many interesting new capabilities, prototypes that are being developed, development or demonstration activities that are being undertaken. You have to have an ability to really identify who are the best performers, who have the greatest capability of scaling and really delivering value at sort of larger scale military programs. That's very unlikely to just kind of bubble up from the bottom. That's something that senior leaders have to be able to really own and define. And I think the question really gets to what is the process by which they do that? So when we talk about competition, when I talk about competition, the thing that I'm interested in seeing is not, a competition of white papers or PowerPoint presentations and sort of a traditional acquisition process and down select. But let's actually take more military, capability out and actually compete it against things. Let's do more bake-offs, fly-offs, shoot-offs, where every single year you have on-ramp opportunities for new entrants to put their own investment into building a capability that they know the government needs based on metrics and performance parameters that the government has said that it wants to hit, with an understanding that if they build it, there will be an opportunity to actually go out and displace an incumbent or compete your way into a large contract and scale faster. Now, you're not going to do this with every capability of the joint force. You're not going to do this with aircraft carriers and large bombers, but you can do it with a heck of a lot of other things, right? From small drones to weapons systems to command and control capabilities, and putting the onus more on regular, routine, sort of level playing field competitions where programmatic and budgetary decisions are going to be made based on the performance of real capability, is something that I think we need to be doing a lot more of as a way of bridging that valley of death and really kind of scaling those programs to figure out, who are the winners that we should really be betting on.
Well, I think we've got some interesting test cases there where we're talking about space launch, for instance, and the private sector, SpaceX's and other things, but also in the satellites that are themselves being launched, because it's very interesting to see that huge variety of things that are being launched for commercial or defense purposes and proven so that they can be acquired. So I think there are some really interesting opportunities for those sorts of tests. You're right. I have a question from two audience members that's almost the same. It's, do we have the right approach with our traditional allies to tackle these new threats, and what will be their role?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a fitting question considering the role that international partners play at NDU. I don't think so is the answer. I think the problem that we have is kind of multifaceted. I think at the strategic level, we pay a lot of lip service to the importance of allies, but when it really comes down to integrating them into our operational planning, really figuring out, kind of what are the critical investments that we each need to make so that we have a capability that adds up to something greater than the sum of its parts. I don't think we do a very good job of that. We still have this tendency as Americans to think that when the heavy lifting has to get done, we're going to do it by ourselves, and our allies are going to sort of stay in the rear and hold our coat. That's not going to work in the future. Just purely from the standpoint of, kind of the arithmetic of power, we're going to need to be able to multiply the power of the United States with the power of our allies in a way that adds up to, a superior military capability to deter conflict. I think, at the level of, actual programmatics and operational investments, we make a lot out of inputs. We beat up our NATO allies over spending 2% of their GDP on defense. It's understandable why we do that. It's a compelling metric. It makes for an easy talking point, but it isn't actually measuring the right thing. When an ally's GDP collapses in the aftermath of the 2009 financial crisis, and all of a sudden their GDP is smaller and they're spending more than 2% of it on the military, that's not the right sort of definition of success here. Right. That there are many allies who may be spending less than 2%, but what they're getting for the capability, or what they're getting in terms of capability for the money that they're spending, allows them to punch considerably above their weight. I think we need to do a better job of really focusing core allies on investments that they need to make so that we can work better together as as an actual coalition or as an alliance. And I would say the final thing, that I would add on that is really to this question of technology transfer and sort of the industrial base. When I was in the Senate, we did a lot to try to get the Department of Defense to look at the industrial base, not just as the United States, but actually to have the United Kingdom, the Australia, kind of critical allies of the United States as part of our national defense kind of technological base. so that we have greater synergy between our industries, kind of greater movement of technology. Too often, for reasons of policy, for reasons of intellectual property, for reasons of other considerations, we limit the technology transfer to allies and partners in a way that makes them less capable. We beat up allies for not making investments in themselves, but then we're unwilling to sell them technologies that could actually make them more formidable military competitors against common adversaries. Certainly that happens all the time, in the Asia Pacific region, to some extent elsewhere. That's something that we need to get beyond. It's not to say that the reasons we've limited those technology transfers or arms sales have been illegitimate. It's more to say that I think in light of the sort of more pressing challenges that we have right now in terms of regaining conventional deterrence, competing effectively with China, with Russia, we're going to lean on we have to lean on the other side of that risk equation to run the risk of empowering our adversaries at the risk of maybe they make some decisions that we're not fully supportive of. Maybe that gives them greater autonomy. But I think that's something that we need to lean into in order to have more capable allies and partners with whom we can work together to solve some of these common problems.
So I'm going to disrupt the flow a little bit and go back to a follow-up question from an earlier point. Would a change to the unified command plan need to be part of the solution to that tension between the services and the combatant commanders?
Yeah, I think ultimately, this question of how we divide up our operational commands is something that we do need to go back and look at. And I think it's not just to sort of pick on the unified command plan. I mean, I think there are a lot of seams that we have traditionally created, which are inevitable. I mean, you have to have organization, you have to divide things up somehow, or it just becomes unworkable. I think the challenge is that when we think about the world through the lens of something like joint all-domain command and control, and sort of the mantra that we hear senior leaders in the department talking about, any sensor, any shooter, best communications node, those are inherently kind of software-defined capabilities. They're agnostic as to the particular domain, the particular sensing modality, the particular effector. That's right. But then we look at how we've organized ourselves. It's largely geographic combatant commands. It's domain-specific military services. We hobble ourselves in our own organization and make it more difficult to come up with the right answers from the standpoint of multi-domain operations or joint all-domain command and control. And ultimately, I think we're going to need to think differently about how we organize ourselves internally to sort of close some of those old artificial seams that I think everybody is increasingly in agreement are becoming impediments to just the way that we're going to think about warfighting in the future. Whether a critical effect comes from the air, the sea, the land, cyberspace, it really doesn't matter so long as it is effective when it arrives and it gets there when I need it. We need to think differently about kind of the ways that those effects are being employed and sort of who is building them and providing them. And I think the problem with the unified command plan is we have increasingly chopped the world up into so many different segments that it becomes a massive bureaucratic exercise to then wrestle everybody back into the same box to figure out how we're going to compete across these seams that we've drawn geographically, functionally. And again, I don't know what the right answer is. We spent some time doing oversight of this when I was in the Senate, but to me, it is a ripe area for oversight and sort of deep thinking and reflection on the part of the Department of Defense, because one of the things that I certainly saw in sort of researching the history of this is that it's not just technology that's critical to military innovation, and it's not just operational concepts, new ways of fighting and operating. It ultimately does come down to the way that militaries and kind of defense bureaucracies are organized around those technologies, around those concepts, and that's something that is probably lagging right now in terms of the conversations that we're having in Washington around military innovation, new ways of warfighting, new types of technology.
So I'm going to combine a couple of things here. There's a comment here about the clash of professional cultures between DoD and tech companies, and how do you do business with startups. Combine that with the concern about bringing back on shore all of our self-sustaining capabilities, whether that's manufacturing or semiconductor production or other things. And the third item here is your book was pre-COVID, which exposed a lot of interesting challenges. How do you look at that and how we work together with the tech sector, acknowledging that we don't have all the capabilities that we need and that that's been laid bare by COVID's exposure, at least, of challenges in the supply chain?
So it's a great question on COVID, and that's certainly, I think, the one answer, which is, you know, our slowness and insufficiency in our response as a nation to be able to provide these kinds of critical capabilities that you would think at first blush should not be as difficult as they seem to have been to provide. I think really kind of underscores the level of problem that we have here. And I think that's broadly applicable. You know, that problem is broadly representative in the defense world as well, which is what I you know, really focused the book on. The bigger, I think, implication of COVID is that you know, our nation was going bankrupt prior to a multi-trillion-dollar stimulus in response to COVID, which, you know, was necessary. I'm not suggesting that it wasn't. It's just to say that it's going to hasten, I think, a lot of these, you know, coming fiscal challenges, looming challenges that, you know, we've known have been coming for many years. This isn't like an earthquake, you know. It's dollars and cents, and the math's not that hard. Defense spending is going to go down, and when it goes down, I think the things that I'm writing about in the book are not just sort of nice to do. They're going to be absolutely essential, because there's not going to be the option of continuing to throw large amounts of money at traditional systems and traditional ways of operating them. Which is largely what we've tried to do in the past. We're going to have to think differently. We're going to have to operate and build the force differently. And to some extent, you know, the resource crunch that we're moving into, you know, could actually catalyze some of that thinking and some of that movement. I think with respect to the tech sector, I think the misnomer that I see kind of in Washington is the belief that the tech sector is monolithic. You know, that everybody who is signing a letter to Google saying that, you know, Google shouldn't be working on Project Maven, that is a very sort of broadly representative opinion in the technology community in America. And the reality is that it just isn't. In the same way that, you know, Washington is full of you know, small numbers of very loud voices that, you know, consume a lot of oxygen and gain a lot of attention, but are not always representative of what people in Washington think. You know, that I sort of tell my friends in the technology community that Washington is, you know, every bit as diverse and no more monolithic than the technology community is. And I find myself telling Washington the same thing about the technology community, that, you know, it's a very diverse place. Don't think that it's, you know, you can paint it with one brush. I think the challenge has been, you know, how does the government create the incentives to actually take advantage of that diversity? And I think that's where we've really hobbled ourselves in recent decades, where we've just made it so bloody difficult for a new company, a technology company, a startup, a small business, a non-traditional defense contractor, to actually figure out what problems the department really wants to solve, to get on contract, to start doing compelling work. To be able to have an opportunity to scale that work on a timeline that is relevant to them. And we force these processes to play out over very, very long, multi-year periods of time. And, you know, most companies just don't have that. They don't have that runway. They don't have that amount of investment. They need a quicker return. So many of them exit simply for reasons of viability. They're driven into commercial business that in many cases they may find less compelling, or it may not be the thing that they really want to do, but they're doing it because they just can't afford to wait around for 6 or 7 years for the department to get its act together and the Congress to get its act together. So we've got to figure out a way of not just getting companies on contract fast, but picking winners and scaling quickly. I think if we begin to do that better and put more points on the board in that regard, you'll start to see more companies that are interested in doing this work. You'll start to see more engineers that are interested in, you know, leaving jobs that they may have in the commercial world to get into the defense sector to do this kind of work. You're going to see more investors that are willing to put, you know, actual investment down on, you know, sort of helping to fund and scale new defense companies or new national security technologies. it is an ecosystem, and it is governed by incentives, and we need to do a better job from the government standpoint of aligning those incentives so that we can actually get the best out of the technology community and the investment community, rather than them, doing the rational thing that they've done for 30 years, which is opt out because it's been too long, too costly, and the returns have been, too minimal to make it worth it. Which is why, you can only point to a handful of successes of startups that have really scaled. So you mentioned SpaceX earlier. There's a reason SpaceX has scaled, and when you have a billionaire founder who has the sort of time and wherewithal to sort of play through that multi-year process, kind of fight the fights with his own customer, ultimately have to sue them to get a fair hearing. That's a long, drawn-out, costly process that most startups just don't have the will or the ability to play out.
Right.
So they either don't get into that work in the first place, or they opt out very quickly. There's a reason this has been happening, and we've got to address those underlying concerns, because it's not all explained by they're from Mars and we're from Venus, and it's a clash of cultures and civilizations. There are actual economic incentives that have been governing a lot of these decisions. And, if we begin to address those better, I think you'll start to see the real diversity that exists in the technology community and the willingness that really is there to work on these hard national defense problems.
Great. I have two more questions. I'll give them both to you so you can decide how to use your time. But the first one might be one that's best left to leadership, as you've discussed it earlier. But should we repair the Bonhomme Richard, or should we reallocate those to the unmanned autonomous battle space awareness systems and others like you have advocated for in your book? And the second is, given everything that we've discussed today, how would you respond to changing needs for JPME? What do you think we need to do differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, on the whether to repair the ship, I mean, I'm honestly just not close enough to it. I don't know the level of damage that's been done. I don't know kind of at a technical level, is it even a viable option? So I'm going to take a pass on that one. But my inclination is to say that, these are the kinds of systems that are probably going to be things that we divest from in the future in order to free up those resources for new and different capabilities like the ones that I'm talking about. And those are decisions that are going to have to be made deliberately. They're going to have to be made, with new capabilities coming in that, you can very clearly point to as solving problems better. But that looks like the kind of trade we're going to have to make in the future, or starting right now. With respect to JPME, it's I'd broaden the question a bit into one of kind of human capital management and the personnel system. I think that we have built a military system around sort of a cookie cutter model, sort of a one size fits all of a military career that is I think increasingly just has been overtaken by events, a lot of events, and is not going to be viable for us in the future. I think we need to be a lot more flexible, and this was something that I did spend a lot of time on when I was in the Senate, and I wish that I could have spent more time working on it, because I really do believe at the end of the day this comes down to a competition for human capital. And going back to the beginning of our conversation, one of the great advantages that we have in this country is just remarkable human talent, and creating the processes and incentives that bring that talent, into military service, into public service, and retain it and develop it. I think is going to be, probably the transcendent challenge that we have in order to stay ahead of our competitors. I think the challenge that we've had is that we tend to do this in this kind of very one size fits all type of approach. We tend to assume that people are going to want to come in and have one career for 20, 30, 40 years, and really not deviate from that. And I just don't think that that's how you get it's not a good human capital management strategy. And it's certainly not, I think, conforming to the ways in which, kind of a newer generation wants to work. So I think, creating more opportunities for people to exit, to go out and have, broadening experiences, educational experiences, to do more time at places like NDU, in sort of less structured ways, to go work in industry, to go work in other parts of our society, and come back in and not be penalized for it, I think is a challenge that we're going to have to address, because that's ultimately, I think, the way that people are going to want to envision their careers in government service. I think it is a better approach to retaining the type of human capital that we're going to need to be successful, and then really thinking about, what are those critical educational characteristics or capabilities that we're going to need people to have, more technical knowledge. You're not going to have to be a data scientist or a software engineer, but you're going to have to be, to a degree, technically conversant in, the underlying capabilities and technologies of things like artificial intelligence, machine autonomy, advanced networking, things like that. Because you're not going to be effective at operating military systems or buying military systems or programming for them if you don't actually understand at sort of a level or two down what's really going on. How to pick and separate sort of winners from losers in that regard. So I think a bigger focus on technical knowledge is going to be important. Broadening experiences is going to be important, and really taking advantage of organizations that we have like NDU. That can adapt, that can take the core things that they do well and add sort of the new things, the new areas that are going to be necessary for the future joint force to become expert in, and really giving them the opportunity to step away from everything that they have been running hard and doing for 2, 3, 4 years at a time, and reset and rebuild skills and build new skills so that they can go back into positions of leadership, command, et cetera, and really be set up well for the future. I think that's the whole game, and I think that JPME is at the center of it, but it's a much broader issue around human capital management, the personnel system, that I think we have a lot of thinking to do and a lot of work to do on things like DOTMA, other areas that I'd like to see us putting more focus on, with JPME being right at the center of that.
Right. Chris, thank you very much. I really appreciated the conversation today. It was interesting. I learned a lot from you and from your book, and I look forward to following up with other conversations in the future. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you
very much. It's been great. I appreciate the time.
Fantastic. To the other audience members who are here, thank you for joining us. I hope this has been useful to you, and I'd appreciate any follow-up questions or any other thoughts that you have on who we should be speaking with. I think that these are valuable to myself, to the students, to our alumni, and to others, but we want to know who else you want to hear from. So please reach out to us. We have another one coming up here in about a month, and that will be with Kylan Hunter, Dr. Hunter, and Dr. Jeanette Haney. They'll be talking about the Women, Peace, and Security Act and why it matters for national security. The implementation for that is starting now, and there are plans out from DoD and from the State Department, so we invite you to join us for that. Thanks very much to everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon. We'll look forward to next time.